Really great to see so many of you in the room, and I'm sure there are many more of you online. Hopefully not online because you couldn't get here due to the floods, which unfortunately probably have been exacerbated by climate change. So my name is Brendan Costello. I am recently joined Soil Association as the Director of Policy and Strategy. Really good to be here at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, having spent yesterday at the Fake Conference, so this is a nice antidote. Obviously, the context for this session today is both the climate crisis and the ecological crisis that we face. We know that agriculture is a driver of both of those things. It contributes around 11% of emissions to the UK total emissions, and intensive farming has probably been the biggest driver of biodiversity decline. So agriculture is going to need to decarbonise itself. Also, some of the land that's currently used for farming is probably going to need to be used to offset emissions from other high-emitting sectors that are hard to decarbonise. At the same time, we need to provide enough land for nature so that we can bend the curve on nature loss. And we also need to provide healthy and nutritious food for the country, hopefully maintaining around 75% domestic food production and maintaining food security, whatever that means. And hopefully we can come to that a little bit later. Sorry? There are a lot of hopefuls, yes, this is very true. Well, hopefully we're going to figure out how to get there. So this presents a real land use puzzle for us. How much land do we need for natural habitat, for wildlife? How much woodland do we need that's going to sequester carbon and provide habitat for wildlife? How much land do we potentially need to just grow food, if any at all? There are plenty of people who think that we do. Or how much of that land should be delivering across all of those things, for nature, for carbon, and food? It's a real puzzle. Whatever we do, agriculture is going to make up the majority of those pieces, but how many of those pieces and what that farming looks like is still the subject of a lot of debate. So there are a lot of trade-offs associated, undeniably. And it's a real challenge to pick the right pathway that's going to reconcile those challenges and minimize those trade-offs. And more fundamentally, how do we even measure net emissions at the farm level? This is really difficult. It's one thing measuring carbon sequestration from trees, but how do you do it in something as dynamic and potentially unstable as soil that's being farmed? It's really difficult. And once we know what those emissions are, how do we make sure that the farmers who are reducing their emissions are rewarded fairly and we have a just transition and that the polluter is being made to pay? And that counts for agriculture, and it also counts for other sectors, lest we have other polluting sectors buying dodgy offsets and not minimizing their emissions themselves. And who should be paying? Typically, the polluter pays principle would suggest that it's those making a profit. But multiple people are making profit from food production, and often it's not the farmers who are making the most profit. So who should it be that's paying? And who should be paying for it at the moment is, again, is a really difficult question. So it could be the farmers, it could be the supermarket, it could be the government, given that it's a public good, and it could be the consumer. At the moment, we've got a real range of people who are paying for it. We've got public money through ELM, we've got private money that's coming through the Woodland Carbon Code, peatland carbon code, and we've got supermarkets wanting to inset. So what does all this mean for farmers? The decisions that they take and the way they try and manage this can have really profound implications for their business and really long-term implications for their business. The prices might change, the schemes might change, so should they stick and when should they twist? I find it bewildering, and it's something that I work on day to day. I'm sure the average farmer is a lot smarter than me, but the average farmer also has to spend 65 hours a week producing the food that we all need to eat. So when are they going to find the time to figure all of this out? So, hot on the heels of Conference of the Parties, where finally food systems were getting the attention they deserve, and in an election year, we have a wonderful panel of experts spanning farming, technology, and policy who can help us guide us through this difficult maze. So, starting to my right, I've got Alex McCannis, who is a Senior Policy Officer at the RSPB, which I think I'm right in saying is the largest nature conservation NGO in Europe, and Alex focuses on BECCS and bioenergy. Got Lydia Collas, who's a Senior Policy Analyst at the Green Alliance, one of our brightest think tanks, and she spends her time thinking about how to reconcile the land use, nature, climate, food production puzzle, and has a PhD which was also doing similar work. To my left, I have Kate Hughes, who is an award-winning journalist and author, and also a farmer in Exmoor. And then Liz Bowles, who is the Chief Executive of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and I believe, well, which is one of the leading tools, I should say, in measuring carbon at the farm level. And I think I'm right in saying also a farmer. I am indeed. Excellent, brilliant. So, without further ado, I think we are starting with Alex.
That's great. Thanks, Brendan. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. So I thought I would just outline at a very sort of high level, at a very high level, in a very high level context, the link between carbon removals and UK land use. So just kind of back to basics, when we think about carbon removals, in 2050, there are going to be some sectors across the UK economy that will remain emitting. And the idea of carbon removals is that we're going to need to mop up or offset those emissions that are still residual within the economy in that period. And some of the more hard to abate sectors include aviation, some forms of heavy industry, and obviously agriculture as well. And so we have two forms of carbon removal at our disposal, two broad categories, one biological and the second engineered. On the biological side, we have things that folks here probably be quite familiar with, so ecosystem restoration, tree planting, peatland restoration, and on farms, things like regenerative farming and soil carbon storage, and more novel techniques like biochar application. But we also have engineered removals at our disposal, and increasingly the UK government are thinking very, very seriously, and in fact banking on technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you grow biomass like bioenergy crops, you burn it for energy, you capture the carbon from it, and you store it underground. This doesn't exist at scale yet, but it's being banked on to reach net zero. And then things like direct air capture, where you suck carbon out of the atmosphere directly. The point I'd make on this slide is really that nearly all of these technologies are heavily related to either land use or land management. And farmers will be crucial in nearly all of these technologies or techniques. And I think that's really important. The scale that we're talking about in terms of removals is vast. So by 2050, the UK government is, again, committing to remove about 80 megatons of CO2 from the atmosphere from engineered solutions alone, and that's about, they think, between 40 to 80% of all removals that will take place. So that's a significant amount. And just to put that in context, it would take about 22 million trees to remove 1 megaton of carbon in a year. So this is a serious conundrum that we're facing in terms of removals. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of pieces of research that the RSPB have been involved with recently. This one firstly relates to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I'm not going to go into the details on BECCS, but hopefully it kind of highlights the land use point that I'm trying to make. So, as I said, the UK government is banking on BECCS quite significantly to reach net zero. And there are significant sustainability issues related to this that haven't necessarily been thought through, particularly around land use, and particularly related to whether biomass is actually carbon neutral or not. But that aside, the RSPB and WWF commissioned this piece of research that was published very recently to understand whether the UK could reach net zero with a far reduced reliance on BECCS. And if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see that 4 scenarios were modelled. The reference scenario is similar to the CCC's balanced net zero pathway, which does rely heavily on BECCS. And you can see that there are 2 scenarios there which rely far less on it. In an AF1, the yellow scenario, what it happens instead is there far more behaviour change across society and far more nature-based solution rollout. So what this is, the more important thing for people in this room is probably around land use. So the 3 points I make here are, one, carbon removals can be very, very land intensive. And you'll see that by 2050, for bioenergy crops for BECCS, particularly in the reference scenario, you need about 800,000 hectares of bioenergy crops and a significant reliance on imports from overseas. AF1, which reduces the amount of BECCS that is used, still requires quite a lot of BECCS in 2050, but doesn't rely on imports. And then when you go to afforestation, you can see that the figures are also quite significant. And if you reduce your reliance on BECCS, we need more nature rollout. And actually, that afforestation figure you can see as a proxy for nature-based solution rollout more generally, not just afforestation. But still, 2.6 billion hectares is huge. It's absolutely enormous. And that's going to have to go somewhere. So the second piece of research that I just wanted to quickly touch on was the Land Use Scenarios project. And this was undertaken by colleagues at RSPB, Tom Finch and others. And essentially what it looked to do was understand whether and how the land use sector can reach net zero by 2050. And it assessed 9 different scenarios. And it changed within those scenarios the levels of nature-based solutions that were rolled out and the way that farming happened across the UK. Again, there's so much I could talk about here, but the very high level kind of finding was that those scenarios which rolled out nature-based solutions most effectively and relied on organic farming were most successful in getting to net zero by 2050 in the land use sector alone. That's just the land use sector, which is emissive currently. So that will also have significant implications and benefits for biodiversity. But there are also trade-offs, and so this slide, it's a graph by the Royal Society, but it highlights the conundrum in terms of land use that we're facing. So you can see the amount of land area that we have, and then you can see the amount of committed land area from UK government. And squaring that circle is going to be really, really tricky. The report that the research that I just talked about, LUSP, essentially highlighted that to be ambitious with nature-based solutions, we are going to have to cut into the amount of farming, productive land for food that we're using, potentially a 20% reduction. And again, that's a significant trade-off that I'm sure we'll touch on in a second. So in terms of how I'd finish off, I mean, there are going to be trade-offs, and this is a really difficult circle to square. Farmers are going to be really key in carbon removal across the UK, nearly all carbon removals, and the scale is vast. And to limit these trade-offs, we need to be thinking about food system transformation, including dietary shifts, but food waste, producing more, growing more food, not feed crops, for example. We need strategic spatial planning. Sorry, yeah. So we need to be thinking about a land use strategy for the UK, for England and across, and coordinating with other countries across the UK. And we're going to need additional ambition across other sectors to reduce the amount of removals we need within the land use sector. For example, what about flying? And then, and I've put this as a question because others will come on to it, but what about maximising non-land intensive removals? Where does soil carbon sequestration come into this picture? And that's all, so thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Over to Lydia.
Thank you. So, as Alex has outlined, because land is so key to storing carbon, to taking carbon out of the atmosphere, net zero is a huge opportunity for farms in the UK. Whilst other sectors can cut emissions, and they are cutting emissions and do need to continue to do so, they can generally become net zero at best. It's almost only on land, setting aside some of these undeveloped technologies that might take carbon dioxide directly out of the air. Land is pretty unique in being able to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that's extremely important for climate change mitigation, which makes it extremely valuable. However, at present, that's not reflected in policy in the UK. We've looked right across the economy in terms of how much policy is in place to deliver the emissions reductions and any carbon removal that is needed to hit the government's own net zero plan. And we've found that the agriculture and land use sector lacks policy more than any other sector, so more than power, more than transport, in terms of getting it, in terms of supporting farmers to get on that pathway that government has set out in their net zero strategy. As of, we last updated that work in June last year. I don't think it would substantially have changed since then, though there's, particularly in some of the devolved nations, there has been some progress. So that's a problem, because carbon storage, or capturing carbon, as we're talking about here, is a public good. The benefits mainly arise off the farm, in that there's less warming in the world, and there's a cost to the farm to doing it. So there needs to be compensation to cover those costs, and whether that's from private investment or public money, and we need policy to guide how that happens. So what should policy be seeking to do that it's not doing? In general, there is this trade-off between how much food land can produce and how much carbon it can store, and that's why there has to be this investment to pay that foregone opportunity cost by focusing more on storing carbon and forgoing some food production. And so we need to see more investment into things like tree planting, which is paid through some of the existing schemes, but I'll come on to how the payment rates are not necessarily where they should be. We need to see investment into restoring peatland, which is really important for cutting emissions, and in time, those wetland habitats they create can become carbon stores. The fact that the policy is not there in the way that it needs to be is reflected in current rates of those activities. So the CCC has shown that peatland restoration is 5 times below the rate where it needs to be, and woodland creation is about half the rate that it should be across the UK. Other habitats are important too. Heathland, scrubland, species-rich grassland can all store carbon. So policy needs to be incentivising the creation of those habitats where appropriate, and that's where we hit this trade-off of where do we choose to focus on food production and where do we choose to focus more on storing carbon. And the land use framework that Alex mentioned, which is forthcoming for England, we've been expecting it for a while, but we really hope that that will give some guidance as to where it's appropriate to focus on these different activities to avoid trade-offs as much as possible. So we've looked at the scale at which these activities might need to happen at, and we think by 2030, about 10% of currently farmed land in the UK needs to be managed primarily for carbon. Some of those habitats still need to be grazed by livestock in order to maintain that, but it is a huge change in land use. The landscape recovery scheme in England, I mainly look at England's agricultural policy, so forgive me that that's where I'm generally talking about. The landscape recovery scheme is a good way to deliver some of that, but it's generally been kept quite small. It's been limited to, in terms of the applications that have been accepted, about half the applications have been rejected from the scheme in both years. And within what's going on, although there's 200,000 hectares that have been entered in round 2, which is a large area, there's only about 7,000 hectares of woodland creation that's going on. So it's possible, it's the headline figures are potentially a bit misleading about the scale of change that landscape recovery is currently delivering. Higher tier countryside stewardship is somewhere else where this habitat creation can happen, but again, that scheme's been limited in size and lots of applicants haven't been able to get into it, which then makes it difficult to access capital, which is really what's needed to make these shifts in farm businesses. We think that about £1 billion a year should be being invested across the UK in terms of capital to support habitat creation, to get on track to net zero by 2030. And the point of injecting that capital to get those habitats created, that means you've got a habitat that sequesters carbon year on year, and that's where there'll be private investment interest in rewarding that. So it's a long-term stream of finance potentially. But the current payment rates for that carbon sequestration are generally quite low. So for example, Countryside Stewardship pays woodland maintenance at £350 per hectare, which if you work that out per tonne of CO2 is about £30. The woodland and peatland carbon codes generally pay more like £10 to £20 per tonne of CO2, so even less. But if you look elsewhere in the economy, the carbon price that is used in the UK's emissions trading scheme for last year averaged at about £70 per tonne of CO2. So it's more than twice, sometimes more than 7 times what's being paid for the carbon sequestration that's going on farms. So that needs to be addressed, and we've looked at what could happen to farm incomes if it was more like that £70 per tonne of carbon dioxide figure. And we found that the average grazing farm could make up all the income that they're losing through the withdrawal of basic payments if they planted trees on half the farm while continuing to graze the other half. The ongoing payments to reward the benefits that habitat creation provides need not be purely public money. As I've mentioned, private investments is looking to buy carbon offsets. And that's a useful source of income, but we really need that to be well governed. And we've been at Green Alliance calling for the creation of an office for carbon removal to govern how that would work, to ensure that any credits are verified and meaningful, and that both gives investors confidence but also ensures that farmers are getting a fair deal, that there's a level playing field, that the same standards are being applied across the board. So yeah, we think that creation of the Office for Carbon Removal is going to be important in this space. And there's other things that government could do to attract private investment in, like agglomerating projects together, because generally investors want to put big money in and lots of things on a farm scale are too small to draw interest. So if there was a way to agglomerate projects together, then that would potentially attract in more private investment. The last point I want to make is to relate back to what Alex was talking about in terms of the other options that there are for carbon removal, and offer, so we do have a choice. We haven't locked into going down the line of relying heavily on these engineered forms of removal that are under development. The plans that the government has come up with do rely quite heavily on that, but it's not all locked in yet. So what I would say is that we want more of the investment in carbon removal to end up on farms, because if it all goes into big business that are going to deliver these tech solutions, then that's going to have much less benefit for rural communities, for biodiversity, for all the ecosystem services that action on land to create these carbon storing landscapes. We could lose all of that if we go down this tech heavy route, which the main potential BECCS supplier, the main potential supplier of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, is a power station that imports wood pellets from around the world, mostly North America. And if that is how we end up delivering much of the carbon removal that we need, then we're reliant on international wood pellet supply chains. The prices could go wherever, as more countries are interested in trying to do this as well. So I think it's a real opportunity on land to attract this investment in, and I think we need to be really I just want it to be really successful, that money is attracted into rural communities rather than going down those engineered routes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Now over to Liz.
Can I have the clicker? Thank you very much. Okay. Morning, everybody. It's really great to be here this morning talking to you. I'm Liz Bowles. I'm the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I'm really lucky to have worked in agriculture all my career, starting off with ADAS, then with English Food and Farming Partnerships, and then the Soil Association, and now as the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And I've also been a farmer in Devon, very close actually to Kate, for the last, 24 years now. So I kind of feel very much steeped in this whole space. And actually, as a farmer, Brendan, it is a minefield at the moment, and having the time to properly understand this whole space is truly difficult for everybody, actually. But this morning, I'm very much sort of talking about it from a farmer perspective and telling you a little bit about my understanding of this space and also what the Farm Carbon Toolkit does. So we'll start with that. This is us. In fact, this is us last year, about a year ago. Since then, we've recruited another 4 or 5 members of staff. So when I joined the organisation in June 2022, we had 10 members of staff. We now have 17, and all of that is down to the demand for what we do. So we're an organisation, we're a community interest company. We were set up by our founders, who included Adam Twine and Jonathan Smith, both of whom are still directors of Farm Carbon Toolkit and very, very active in the organisation. And the organisation was set up with a really clear mission, which we hold to today, which is to help farmers to understand their farm carbon footprints and to help them on that journey towards net zero within thriving, nature-friendly farms. And I say that, you know, absolutely meaning it, that it's about working with farm businesses to ensure they can remain thriving whilst at the same time reducing emissions and farming in a nature-friendly fashion. Because certainly there's been much talk about it over the last couple of days here, that we mustn't have carbon tunnel vision, and also that we really cannot effectively combat climate change unless we also focus on reversing the decline in nature and also reversing degradation of our soils. They all go together. And it's certainly something that I've learned through my career in agriculture. I mean, looking back on it now, I almost sort of quake in my boots at some of the advice I would have given during the 80s and 90s as an ADAS advisor. But that was then. But in terms of the, you know, understanding of the importance of ecosystem services and the role of nature in ensuring those ecosystem services function, we looked upon it as a nice to have, not as essential. I think increasingly now we understand the essential nature of those ecosystem services, especially if we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as farmers. And I'll come on to that in a minute, because first and foremost, everybody, the first thing to focus on is reducing emissions. And I absolutely agree that farmers have the biggest opportunity of anybody globally to remove carbon. But also, firstly, as farm businesses, we've got to reduce the amount we're pumping into the atmosphere, because for most of those gases that we pump up there, they'll stay there for at least 20 years and probably 120 years. So, you know, it's great to better remove it, but we're making our job harder all the time by keep on pumping it up there. So at Farm Carbon Toolkit, that is absolutely our mission. We do it in 2 ways, through our marvellous team of on-farm advisors who go that extra mile onto farms. And actually, it's one of the things I've learned through my career, that having people who understand what it's like for farmers is absolutely critical. And it's absolutely critical right now to supporting farmers to understand their options and how best to navigate this space. And certainly myself as a farmer, I kind of quake when I see the kind of information that I might better find online that's completely irrelevant to myself as a business. So having somebody that can interpret that is now more important than ever. And alongside our team of advisors, we've also, we set up, we were one of the first organisations to build a farm carbon calculator, and it's now one of the most popular calculators used in the UK, and it's free for farmers to use. And unlike some of the other calculators, and I don't know how many of you were in this fantastic session this morning on the role of grazing livestock, and Michael Lee talking about the fact that emissions per kilogram are not the way to go, simply because each kilogram of food produced on a farm is not equal. You know, you've got some kilograms of food which are primarily starch, others like meat, which are very high quality sources of nutrients for humans, and we need to look at them differently. So at the Farm Carbon Toolkit, our calculator does a whole farm balance. We look at all the emissions, and we also look at the sequestration. I'll tell you more about that later when I talk about the calculator itself. So what I'm going to do, first of all, and I don't make any apologies for really going back to basics, because it's an area where we're all learning. And when I look at climate change and agriculture, and very often I get asked questions by journalists, and there was one last year who was looking at wanting to write an article on whether dairy cows could be carbon neutral. And I kind of got a bit of a sense that I was intrigued as to his understanding of this. So I asked him a very straightforward question. I'm going to ask all of you it now. My guess is you'll get the answer right. So my question was this: what proportion of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions do you consider are produced by agriculture up to the farm gate? Any thoughts on a number? Just shout out a number to me. 3%. I got 3%. Heather, what was your number? 10? Any advance on 10? Sorry, 17? 35. Right. Thank you. I mean, that's the normal range I hear. 3% is fantastically low. The actual number, as recorded by DEFRA in their annual climate change report, I think it's called, actually was 11% last year. So Heather, you win the prize. But this journalist thought it was over 30%. Now, the reality of it is that if you add together not just the emissions from farming up to the farm gate, but also including first stage processing, manufacturing, all the way to our fridges, it is 30-odd%. So it depends really which stat you are declaring. But I imagine that many of you in the audience are farmers, and I think it's really helpful to have a really clear understanding of what we do contribute to the UK's total emissions. It's 11% nationally. I have to say, myself and Kate farming in the southwest, Devon and Cornwall, our contribution from agriculture is much higher, mainly because there's less people, less other industry, and an awful lot of cattle and sheep. So it does vary, and globally it probably is higher. But I think it's useful to have that information at your fingertips as a farmer. So this really sort of shows it. And unlike the generality, the greenhouse gases that are emitted from agriculture are different than in general. You can see carbon, in fact, can you all see it? Yes, it's just about big enough. So carbon dioxide from agriculture is a relatively small proportion at 10%, whereas methane coming from livestock themselves and from manure management is the majority at 60%. And nitrous oxide, which is primarily coming from our reliance on artificial nitrogen fertilizers, is in there at 30%. And that's really why agriculture has got different questions to answer. It's not just about electrification, which, you know, for transport, that will solve a lot of problems. We've got, and we're dealing with biological systems. So and I think it's just worth having an understanding of where the greenhouse gases are coming from. And again, if we look at that for arable farms and for ruminant livestock farms, and these are very much sort of average numbers, but again, that they give you a sort of a real heads up as farmers where you need to be focusing. So if you're an arable farmer, over 50%, probably more like, well, in fact, it'll be 75% of your emissions will be coming from the fertilizers that you're using, both their production and application, as well as field use and field operations, i.e. the machinery you're using on farm. So as an arable farm business, really the big heads up is to reduce reliance on artificial nitrogen fertilizers and look at how you manage land. absolutely critical. And by comparison, and in fact, it's kind of almost, it's kind of weird, but chemicals, crop protection chemicals, relatively small impact in terms of emissions. Massive impact in terms of biodiversity, but not so great when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Then if you look at ruminant livestock farmers, and this is where the whole sort of issue of should we be farming ruminants comes from, because of their ability to produce methane. Again, I should make it clear that this is all calculated on GWP 100 rather than GWP star, and I'm not going to go into that this morning in my 10 minutes, but this whole space is evolving. And probably I think the thing I would say here is that all carbon calculators, ourselves including, are rapidly evolving as the science changes, as we learn more. If you think about it, 5 years ago, this science was absolutely in its infancy, and the rate of change is massive. Having said that, what's holding back our ability to be ever more accurate is the lack of research evidence, because a lot of that research evidence takes years to accumulate, and you'll see that in a minute from a slide I'm going to show you. So that, and that's the other thing to mention here, manure management for ruminant livestock farms and imported feedstuffs is in at 10%, and primarily we're talking here about soybean meal. And certainly ourselves and a lot of organisations are currently involved in some DEFRA-funded projects looking at how the UK can increase its production and use of peas and beans as opposed to, and reduce reliance on imported soya, because that will have a tremendous impact both on reducing the greenhouse gases from UK agriculture, as if we were to grow more peas and beans, we would need less nitrogen fertilizers, and if we then feed those peas and beans, we would be importing less soya, a lot of which comes from deforestation sources. Yes. So now I'm just going to very briefly talk on developments in carbon footprinting in the UK. And despite, I think, this morning, one of the sessions I was in, the conversation turned to calculators, carbon calculators, and there's a real kind of concern that calculators give different answers. And that is true, but what I would say on this, two things really. Firstly, just very recently, DEFRA commissioned ADAS to look at the five leading calculators in the UK, of which we're one, and put 30 model farms through those calculators. And the conclusion that ADAS came to was that, yes, the calculators do provide different answers, but that's because they're asking slightly different questions. And a lovely comment from ADAS was that there are some wrong ways to do carbon calculations, but there is no one right way. And that I think is something which ourselves, as well as two of the other leading calculators, are addressing this year through working together where we can to develop common methodologies. And I think that will really help provide confidence to everybody that you can use a calculator with confidence. For now, though, for all farm businesses, understanding where you are now is so important. Just to know where you're starting from, because otherwise, how do you know where to focus your efforts to reduce emissions? So that's really, I would suggest, whatever calculator you use, I mean, by all means use ours, it's free. It will take you probably about 5 minutes to get yourself signed up with an account and start putting your emissions into the calculator. But this first step is so important to understand where you're starting from. And this slide just shows you what the summary report from our calculator looks like. And it's showing you both your emissions, your sequestration, and the balance. So we do enable farmers to record their carbon sequestration into soils, into trees, and into hedgerows. But they do rely on measurement rather than on modelling. Having said that, we do include modelling from things like some countryside stewardship prescriptions where Natural England has suggested a level of likely sequestration, for instance, things like GS2, other prescriptions where that information exists. So as a farmer, if you tell us how many hectares of those prescriptions you've got, it will model likely sequestration. Okay, I'm going to move on because I'm pretty certain that Brendan's going to wish he could kick me. Okay, so this market, I was asked to talk about the sort of voluntary carbon market a little bit and the sort of how farmers potentially might want to interact with those. And I'd kind of like to start by saying that at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we aren't involved in carbon trading and we never will be. What we want to be able to do is to support farmers to understand where they are at. And our position on carbon trading is that for all businesses who are looking to potentially market carbon credits, ideally, they do need to get to net zero on their own farms first, because potentially otherwise you can be selling carbon, but actually making yourself a more high carbon producer. And I think the second sort of element to consider there as a farmer is how much of that carbon you might need yourself in future years. And I must admit, I was jotting down sort of notes to myself as Lydia was speaking, because it really set the thoughts rolling in my mind. And just a very brief anecdote. Last year we had our annual field day at Julian Gold's farm, who's a very excellent arable livestock farmer in Oxfordshire, actually not very far from here. And his soil carbon levels, or soil organic matter levels now, at the centre of his fields, are fast approaching the levels of organic matter under his hedges. And he posed the question, that means that going forward, my ability to increase soil organic matter to offset the emissions on my arable farm are going to get less. And that really set me thinking, ooh, and my note to myself when Lydia was talking is we've got to properly reward farmers who are already doing a good job, because otherwise we simply risk rewarding those farmers who started off from a very low base. And certainly the temptation for those farmers who've done a great job, especially myself as a livestock farmer in Devon, I haven't ploughed anything for over 30 years, but I could. And I'm not saying, it's that kind of real thing. How do we do this fairly for everybody? And I just wanted to sort of mention that as a preface to this sort of conversation about voluntary carbon markets, because clearly farmers are in a great place to be able to store more carbon in their soils, and indeed they are. And I've chosen not to put the slide up showing the likely levels of both sequestration and emissions on farm, but the one number that always sticks in my mind is that for every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter, that will store around 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And that's quite significantly. 0.1% equals 9 tonnes of carbon stored. So I just wanted to, oh, my apologies, my table doesn't look as nice as it did on my screen. I wanted to just put up a couple of things, and these very much lead on from what Lydia was talking about, really, because this is such a new market, the voluntary carbon market, and its evolution is coming along rapidly. And this slide just sort of says that about this time last year, the Sustainable Soils Alliance produced a report. They'd had some funding from NERF to develop a farmland carbon code, to actually develop a farmland carbon code. But at the end of the day, they produced a report with recommendations on best practice for soil farmland carbon codes. And that happened at roughly the same time that the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets was created, the so-called ICVCM. And that organisation is hosted by the Green Finance Institute in the UK. And what I've put underneath in this table is simply the ICVCM's core carbon principles. And effectively, they are exactly the same as the best practice recommendations that the Soil Farmland Carbon Code report came up with. And they also mirror many of your comments, Lydia. So and these are the things that we have to focus on going forward. And I just, in the time I've got left, draw your attention to that middle column, because for agriculture, these are critical. And going forward, additionality. So that means that if as a farmer you're going to accept carbon credits, the scheme has to be for something which you wouldn't be doing otherwise in the normal course of your farm business activity. And that's pretty, that's quite a tricky one sometimes to prove. And the second one is permanence. In my understanding of agricultural soil, we tend to go through processes of building up soil reserves, exploiting those reserves, and then building them up again. So the only carbon that we can get credits for is the stuff that doesn't ebb and flow. And I think that's quite important. Then obviously robust quantification is really critical. I think Brendan is trying to kick me. Yeah, which is why I'm going to stop there and say thank you.
Thank you.
Rats. I was hoping she was going to carry on, so I didn't have to talk quite so much. That was fascinating, thank you. This is a really interesting conversation for me. Some of that is reassuring as a farmer, some of that is slightly terrifying. Most of that's overwhelming, I've got to be honest. I want to talk about this in a slightly different way. My name is Kate Hughes. I have a farm on Exmoor, 450 acres mixed farm. It's bloody beautiful, frankly, but I'm not the only person who thinks it's special. There were Neolithic kings buried up there. There are, it's an Anglo-Saxon hamlet that the name is still relevant to the original description. It's in Doomsday, and my husband's family has been there for at least 300 years. What I'm trying to say is that when we took over the keys 3 years ago, there was absolutely no pressure not to screw this up royally. But we had inherited a conventional farm that was on its knees in a lot of ways, I'm going to be honest. So obviously the first thing we did with such high pressure from a long period was to start all over again. Except that we didn't. We talked to my father-in-law, who still worked on the farm. We still talked to my grandfather-in-law, who still thought he worked on the farm. And we came up with a plan to overhaul the system that we were working to in quite a dramatic way. We took the space that we were given and we decided that what we wanted to do was achieve 4 things in every aspect of our farm every day. And those things are soil health, biodiversity gain, absolute gain, I'm not interested in net anything, frankly. The production of nutritionally valuable food, and climate change mitigation. And to do that, we took a map and we started drawing all over it. And we came up with a strategy that connected the woodlands that were on our borders, the tiny parcels that we still had. I'm an Exmoor farmer, my farm is like that. But it gives me a great opportunity to take some of the semi-ancient stuff and really maximize the effect of that for biodiversity. And for beauty, frankly. I've got to live there. My kids have got to grow up there. Sorry. I shake, so I'm trying to, it's nothing personal. So we connected all those wildlife corridors up, for want of a better term. Actually, no, that is a better term. And we came up with a plan to plant 150 acres of new broadleaf woodland. Meanwhile, in another 150 acres, we are starting now to really push our agroforestry position. So I currently have just over 1,000 walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts. That's really exciting to me because I'm a vegetarian livestock farmer. So my aspiration, ultimately, and we talk about a farm carbon position. One of my aspirations for the farm, for example, is to have outputs that mimic the flexitarian model, fundamentally. So I want to see my livestock numbers drop through the floor, frankly. As far as I'm concerned, they still need to be there. That's a different debate for another day. But I'm really excited about the other outputs on my farm. So our livestock outwinter. We bale graze during the winter. We mob graze them, which is slightly mad, especially in this weather. And we are now in a position where we're trying to see where we're up to. And this is where the farm carbon toolkit has really come into its own. Meanwhile, we're trying to work out how we respond to the demand for carbon, how we respond to that market, and in what is clearly a seller's market, what tiny, tiny power we can exert on the wider world, I suppose. So I was nervous about coming here and talking to you guys about what we do. I was nervous that I was going to get roasted for being involved in this market at all, frankly, and that's fair enough if you want to crack on with that. We have two aspirations for our involvement in the voluntary market, and I think it's really important that we address that. One is that I will not be talking to any private companies, and we will be talking to primarily private companies, about selling what is a valuable output from my farm to anybody who hasn't already reduced their carbon by 50%, at least. I want them to be local to me. I want to look them in the eyes. I want to understand who they are. I want them to have absolutely no investment in the fossil fuel industry at all. And I think that has to be a part of my criteria, so that I can sleep at night, frankly. And I think we have to talk about that more carefully, because I think there's a real risk here that farmers are exposing themselves to a massive reputation issue. And I think that it's really interesting how much the conversation around mental health has come up in terms of transitioning from a conventional into a fully agroecological position in the last couple of days. And I think even this feeds into that. So I'm really excited about being involved in this market. I'm really excited about what's happening on my farm. I'm bloody proud of it. But I also am really excited about the potential that farmers like me have to exact a little bit of power, and deliver a little bit of change by being involved in this, in the beginnings of this exciting market as a tiny part of my farm's output that is fundamentally integral to everything that I'm doing, that isn't over here somewhere, that isn't a Sitka plant, a Sitka plantation that's doing nothing for my biodiversity. And I'm really excited about doing this with integrity and care and due diligence. And that's it.
That was brilliant. Thank you all. Kate, I'm gonna come to you first, just quickly. Really interesting to hear what you were saying about not wanting to sell credits to other businesses that are not doing everything they can to decarbonise. How easy or hard is it for you to find that out?
I'm relying quite heavily on my background as a journalist. My background is economics, business, and latterly environmental journalism. So I love the deep dive, but even I find that quite overwhelming. Today I found one business that I'm prepared to work with.
Sorry, is this one business that's come to you, or just one business out there?
A bit of both, really. Let's just say a positive meeting of minds. Yeah, so, and don't get me wrong, we have been approached over and over and over again by certain banks, for example, law firms that represent some really questionable clients, but that's why I like kind of going, right, come on then, who are you, what's your deal? But I have a skill set that doesn't necessarily help me on a wet January when I'm in a farm, but, you know, can help me on this. And I recognize that my husband doesn't have it, and even I find that really quite overwhelming. So that, I'm worried for my industry.
So what needs to happen to help people who don't have your investigative skills?
I'd really like to see a kind of some advice on how to navigate this, obviously. But I'd like to see some kind of benchmarking advice about, okay, no farmer wants to screw up his land. No farmer wants to screw up the climate. We're all keen on biodiversity. You know, who doesn't have the melon app? But I don't think we are duly aware of the impact that our choices for our buyers has.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I'm going to generally take questions in a second, but I think I've got one question here which is very specific to this conversation. Okay, I'll come to that later then, thanks. So Liz, very interested to hear you say that you think all farms should get to net zero before they sell credits to those other sectors that are trying to get to net zero. One of the things that concerns me is that a lot of farms at the moment are selling credits to other sectors, and that if and when they are made to get to net zero themselves, they will have sold those assets that enable them to do that. Do you think that is also a problem? Do you agree that that's an issue? And what can be done to resolve that if it is?
I'm not sure if it is an issue or not, Brendan, because it will depend just on the level of credit sales that they've made, and also on the conditions under which those sales have been made. Because at the moment, it's pretty much unregulated. And what I would say to any farmer that's entering this market is read the small print incredibly carefully. And there's one, literally it was this time last year, I was contacted by an organisation that was actually wanting to trade a farmer's carbon, but they were doing it in a pretty robust way. But then when they were talking to the farm manager, the farm manager read through his sales contract for grain, only to find a clause in there that they'd signed up to, without knowing it, because they hadn't been told, that any emissions reduction that accompanied that grain would pass to the buyer of the grain. So, I mean, I'm not even sure that was enforceable, but, you know, it was, so, but there is a danger, and certainly I do think that sometimes farmers have signed up to stuff that they didn't fully understand the longevity of the implications. Because that is the reality of these things, that you're not, you know, in some cases it might be a shorter period of time, but then the question I then have is about how can they demonstrate permanence over a short period of time. And that was why I put up those 10 core principles, because eventually those core principles will become a properly enforced requirement for this voluntary carbon market. That's not there yet, but it will come.
That's really helpful. And so where farmers aren't likely to get the permanence, how can they get a competitive advantage if they're still doing the right thing?
Whew. Now that really is a very good question, because there are lots of farmers who are doing the right thing. And as I mentioned, this sort of ebb and flow of soil carbon is normal, it's natural. And certainly, I've just finished it now before Christmas, and I can see one of the commissioners in the audience. We did some work for Students for Sustainability, looking at the financial incentives required to support farmers to take on more agroecological farming practices. Because at its heart, that's the biggest challenge of all of this. We do know that agroecological farming practices have huge benefits for biodiversity, for soil health, primarily actually for soil health, and potentially for reducing emissions, especially where those agroecological farming practices include reduced reliance on artificial nitrogen chemicals and also changes in tillage. So I did this work, and I have to say that increasingly the support that DEFRA is offering through Countryside Stewardship and SFI will provide some almost enough support for practice change. The elephant in the room being the level of reduction in output that accompanies it. And I think no one should think that we'll be able to carry on producing as much food as we do now, or at least if we persist in the same structure of food production, if we move to more agroecological farming. But I do, to answer your question squarely, I do think there's a real need to look at how to better reward farmers who are doing the right thing already, because they won't have the headroom to benefit from voluntary carbon markets. And currently the support that is being offered is kind of targeted at very specific things. And certainly the analysis I did for SOS really demonstrated to me that the bit that's really not properly supported is introduction of longer, more complex rotations into arable farms with livestock. That's simply, the support for that is not enough.
Okay, thanks. Just again, one more question for you, Liz. So you mentioned the fact that the measurements tend to come out with similar results, but often people are asking different questions. You also talked about some of the risks associated with focusing on carbon too much. If you take too narrow a lens, there are trade-offs with nature and with animal welfare. Do you think that the government should play a more active role in setting the questions so that we're getting the right breadth of information when we're doing the monitoring to avoid some of those trade-offs?
I mean, certainly we're cooperating absolutely with DEFRA and the harmonisation work for calculators, but I think there's a bigger question, and this is the one really about the trade-offs, where you've got, on the one hand, a real focus on, especially for livestock, rearing them quickly to minimise their emissions through life and selling and killing them young, and basically keeping them indoors in intensive systems, which is hugely non-beneficial for animal welfare, versus the more agroecological farming system, which is looking at predominantly forage-based livestock systems, including for pigs and poultry. And that's an area where, we haven't really talked about that at all, but certainly transition to more agroecological farming systems would see a reduction, a greater reduction in our reliance on pigs and poultry as sources of human protein, because of their huge reliance on crops which could be used to feed people more directly. So the calculators will do what is required of them. And interestingly, I think society has to think about what it really wants from farmers.
Okay, thanks. Lydia, you talked really interestingly about the I guess the financial challenges facing our upland farmers and the need to pay them better so that they're providing the public goods that we want them to be providing. That obviously requires a big uplift in the amount of money that they would receive. Have you done any kind of modelling or thinking around what that would mean for the ELMS budget, if that were to come out of the ELMS budget? And then how do you plug any gaps so we've got enough money for nature around the rest of the country?
Yeah, we have. So in England, the ELM budget is £2.4 billion a year. If we took 10% of currently farmed land and focus mainly on storing carbon on that land, it would only take 400 million of that budget to pay on that land at a rate that more than doubles what farmers are making compared to presently on that land. So, and there is space in the budget to do that because of the phase out of basic payments. My worry is that that money won't be available because of the payment rates being offered on options that are mainly focused on arable farms. And that relates back to this problem of payment rates being set based on income foregone. So it's all about the value of the produce that it's replacing rather than the value of what's being delivered. I think there's some indication from yesterday's announcements where we're moving away from that in particular options. So raising the water table on permanent pasture in the lowlands is now being paid above £1,300 a hectare, which is very close to the arable rates, even though the income foregone would be much higher on the arable land. So in places, it looks like we're moving away from it, but on the whole, we're not at all. And generally, my worry is that the money won't be available for the uplands because so many of the options are more focused on arable farms, and we could end up spending most of the money there, leaving this problem in the uplands.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to move on to the audience in a second, and I'm getting menacing looks. But Alex, just very quickly, on the food, not feed side of things and freeing up land, can you expand on what you would want to see happen to actually realise that vision? How can we make sure that we're producing food for people and not feed for livestock? What can the government do to help make that happen?
Well, I mean, ultimately, this partly comes down to some level of dietary shift across society, which would mean probably eating less meat, and shifting and rewarding agricultural systems that produce better meat, as I know the Soil Association would say. So this less but better principle would probably apply. I mean, I think just generally at the sort of very high level, I think there's in general a lack of leadership in this space, and I would say the National Food Strategy a few years ago produced quite a compelling blueprint for how we might go about shifting the makeup of what agriculture looks like and what our food system looks like. And at the time, it was never properly taken forward. And in fact, in some ways, I think the government are probably guilty of certainly pushing it to the side. And I think, particularly on things like dietary shifts, there is a need for more leadership, and we need to talk more openly about the challenges, but also about the opportunities that come from those shifts. Yeah, that's what I say. And just quickly, can I say, Kate, I really admire your, and think it's really really inspiring your approach to the agreements that you're thinking about. I think just in general, this is why government needs to step in, and there needs to be a regulation around the voluntary carbon markets. And the CCC have been really clear on this, and it's absolutely crucial. We need to be thinking about what principles should businesses be adhering to, the Oxford carbon offsetting principles, for example. But I think it's amazing that you are taking that leadership in that role.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got lots of people waiting patiently online, so we're going to go to them first for some questions.
We've just got two online. They've both been partly answered, so I'll just paraphrase a little bit. The first one is about whether or not there are working examples of land management changes that have been able to demonstrate carbon benefits that also produce more food. So there's the example of nut trees, which you mentioned, but also is there any examples of shifting from livestock to growing other sources of protein that have been able to demonstrate a carbon benefit? So that was one question. The second one is about enforcement and what the panel's views are on how well enforced carbon credits are at the moment and what needs to happen to make sure that the grandfathering problem doesn't exist. That's it online. Keep them coming.
Okay, thanks. So, Liz, do you want to go? Cheers.
So, examples of farming practices which store more carbon. I'd say that, or more protein. I think agroforestry is probably the best example there, simply because you're growing crops at different heights, and that does offer the potential, if done well, to be able to both store more carbon and produce more food, albeit different types of food. But I think I would say, though, that, and this is where more research is needed, that typically changing to more agroecological farming practices, there's not, most of the evidence would point towards overall a reduction in output, not necessarily a reduction in quality of output, but a reduction in quantity of output. And that shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, because it depends what we're producing as food. Certainly, if we look at the transition in our diets, which absolutely is going to be necessary in the next 50 or so years, it will mean we won't need to grow as many crops for livestock. And that frees up land for growing better quality foods for us as human beings. And I think that's really important. So that would be sort of my answer to that one.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So our arable had historically been feed, disappeared off into the commodities market. No kind of fairly average prices for it. We're now we produce wheat, so heritage and population wheat, rye, naked oats, all on an organic basis. We're no till, no spray. We'll see how that pans out. And so I can't stand talking about yield. It drives me nuts. Profitability is what should be driving these discussions. When we were coming, so in our conventional system, our arable outputs were coming in at about 4 tons. They're now coming in at 1, but I'm making 3 times as much on it because I'm feeding people, not animals.
Brilliant. Alex, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just one point I'd make, and it relates to your point, Liz. I think, so first of all, there is probably some wiggle room here in that there is probably an over-application of inputs. So with some reduction, you could probably maintain yields with some improvements for biodiversity. But also moving forward, as the climate continues to change, a farming system with reduced inputs will be a more resilient system. And so actually what we're comparing is a future more resilient system to a future less resilient system, which may have previously been producing higher yields. In the future, a more resilient system actually may be more comparable, and I think that's quite important.
So on that note, there are some who would argue that farmers shouldn't be receiving public money to adopt practices that actually make their business more profitable long term. Anyone have any views on that on the panel?
That's really interesting because our long-term aim is to be a closed farming system, so all our outputs come back in unless they're being sold to people to be eaten. But we aspire to be a subsidy-free farm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just quickly, Liz, I want to get to the audience. Yeah.
Well, I'll just add to that I think what's needed right now is that incentive to tip farmers over the edge to adopt those practices. And I think once they've kind of normalised them, I think you're right, Brendan, they don't need the money.
Okay, great.
Well, I don't think Elm should be built on the principle that yields have to decrease for farmers to receive payments.
Okay, brilliant. Lady in the green, first hand up of the day, finally gets to ask a question.
Oh, hi. If you want to join the dots, please hear me out, because this goes into a lot of different areas. So I'm going to read, I get nervous. Owing to human activities, over 2/3 of the carbon that used to be in the soil is now in the atmosphere, trapping heat. So why are we aiming at net zero when what we should be doing is carbon negative? And if you're going to be offsetting, surely you're offsetting because you can do carbon negative if you farm sustainably, right? So if you're talking about carbon calculators, when you have a carbon calculator that says that the carbon impact of beef is like way at the top, and you've got a lentil at the bottom, that is all unsustainably grown food. If you've got sustainably grown food, it should have a negative access where it doesn't matter what you eat, it just matters how it's grown, because anything you eat from the negative axis will be sequestering carbon. So what we need, I don't think there's enough money in the world to pay farmers to farm or not to farm it has to be a true cost economy. We need a soil-based economy, not an oil-based economy. And the elephant in the room, in my opinion, is the artificial fertilisers at 5.5 tonnes a tonne to manufacture. To give perspective, steel is 1.6. So you can't, until you take those out of the equation, I mean, if you could just simply have a carbon tax that makes artificial fertilisers prohibitively expensive, and then we all have to learn to do it properly, you know, and that's the end of it. You don't have to pay anybody to do anything. If you want to pay anybody to do anything, then why not give them a loan? Because, you know, so that loans are according to need, not according to the profit the bank can make from it, and then repayable like a student loan, so that you can, when you can afford to pay it back, you know, so the money is available for people to do the things they need to do without having to go through all these awful hoops that you get when you're trying to apply for grants. And if you give one person a grant, you're disadvantaging another person who didn't have the grant, and also the people that were already doing it right. I'm sorry.
Shall I have a go at that one? Thank you. I can feel sort of your passion for all of that in the question, and it is complicated, and certainly I sympathise with the fact that so many farmers who are already doing the right thing actually are not in a place where they're going to benefit from some of these new markets, because they call it headroom. Because if you've already are doing something well, you're not relying on inputs, and you've stored a lot of carbon in your soils, and you're growing trees, and your hedges are huge, your ability to store a lot more is simply not there. But that, in a way, that, I suppose I'm going to say that's not the point, although it really is. But the sort of the points win prizes bit is about storing more to get carbon out of the air now. And that, yeah.
So the planet would be a dry crust if it weren't for nature building organic matter. So we don't have to do anything. It will do it itself. Like the wildflower pastures, they're arguably just as much carbon sequestering as a forest. You know, it doesn't matter. I think the problem is the damage that we're doing. The way that we farm strips carbon from the soil, and also it makes us dependent on fossil fuels for our food. How ridiculous. If we want to stop using fossil fuels, we can't use artificial fertilizers anymore.
And absolutely, I mean, my last slide was literally looking at that, because as a farm business, and as I did say, farmers have got to reduce their emissions, and you know, everybody has to reduce our emissions, and us as human beings. You know, the very fact that we all travelled here, whether we travelled here by car or by train or by walk, you know, there will be emissions associated with that. But certainly, all farm businesses, nitrogen fertilisers, huge source of emissions on farms, and yes, you are right, we will have to find ways of reducing that reliance, although the fertiliser manufacturers are working very hard, you can be certain of it, on producing lower emissions fertilisers, and they are. Yeah, but that isn't the point.
So I think we're going to have to...
Yeah. I'm not saying they don't. Not at all. But so some farmers will choose to go to lower emissions fertilisers, but if effectively the transition to more agroecological farming, which doesn't need them, is the answer.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, gentleman in glasses.
Okay. We're reasonable-sized dairy farmers, and we used to supply Arla. And you have to provide, or they work out your carbon footprint, etc. Our figures, even though we're forage-based, we don't feed any meal, we don't provide any concentrate, we don't put any fertilizer on. Our figures were a hell of a lot worse than an intensive 1,000-cow dairy unit, indoor housed, maize, fert, everything. So how does that work?
Right. Two reasons for that. It will be partly down to the fact that Arla has very much focused on reducing, or rather, the intensive method for reducing emissions by having higher yields per cow rather than actually relying on forage-based systems. And also the calculator you will have been which will have been used for you, was only looking at emissions per kilogram of milk produced. It wasn't looking at any benefits you were providing in terms of carbon sequestration into soils. And typically, more extensive farming dairying systems will have greater benefits for soil carbon sequestration than more intensive farming systems. And neither do they take any account of other factors such as likely higher levels of ammonia pollution from very intensive farming systems. Those simply aren't taken into account. And that really is, in a way, is the kind of the question that Brendan asked me earlier about, you know, how do we measure these things? And that, it is at the crux of it. But I can give you some hope in that at Farm Carbon Toolkit last year, our technical director, Becky Wilson, did some work comparing more agroecological dairying systems with more, well, I call them 24/7 systems. I mean, those systems where dairy cows are indoors all the time. And that there is a carbon benefit from more extensive forage-based systems. Not massive, but they can be done as well on a carbon basis. I mean, the reason why you won't look as good is because your stocking rate, my guess is your stocking rate will be slacker than those dairy farms which actually are indoors all the time. And actually the other great big elephant in the room, which we are addressing this year, and I must admit, when I joined the Farm Carbon Toolkit, I kind of felt that, because I used to be a business management advisor and I know just how expensive rearing dairy heifers is, that no calculator currently properly accounts for brought in dairy livestock. So if you're running a flying herd, you will look better per litre of milk produced than if you've got all your dairy young stock included in that calculation. And that might be actually the biggest reason for the difference. You might be being compared to 24/7 flying herds.
Interesting, thank you. Lady in the front, otherwise known as Ellie.
Thank you. Really interesting panel. So my question was, how does biodiversity on farm relate to carbon storage, and whether that could be valued, whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
And whether or not indeed that can be stacked and bundled. Who wants to go on that one? Lydia.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that. So I think biodiversity is valuable. It's so much harder to turn into a quantified amount than carbon, because there's been so much work looking at what is the potential damage per tonne of CO2 in the atmosphere, therefore what's the value of if that's taken out of it. So I think we just don't have as much of a basis as to how we would value biodiversity. But in the same way that I think it makes sense to reward carbon sequestration, because that's how farms then do it, that's how we get it done. It needs to be financially rewarded. I don't see why we shouldn't also do that for biodiversity. Biodiversity net gain, the new policy, well, it's been around for a bit of time, I suppose, in England, is valuing biodiversity, and that scheme has faced various criticisms and has got lots of teething problems. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops as sort of the first scheme that does put financial amounts on biodiversity at sort of a government level. But yeah, I think it's an area that is going to develop massively in the next 5 years.
Sorry.
I'll go first. Yeah, I mean, interesting. What I was going to say to this question is that there are sort of emerging models where farmers are actually coming together to form cooperatives. And the one example I'd cite is the Environmental Farmers Group, where they're working together. I think it's something like 50,000 hectares now in this group, and where they're selling nutrient neutrality and biodiversity type of offsets to buyers. But the reason I'm mentioning it is a little bit like Kate was suggesting about farmers taking control in this area. There's a real need for farmers to take that control, and there's actually nothing stopping them from doing it. other than just the time it takes to do it and the expertise to do it well, because it's a different job to farming. But at the same time, actually, the very fact that for all these things to happen requires farmers to do something and requires the land that they steward to be involved. It actually does put quite a lot of cards in farmers' hands if they choose to play them. And I've worked in agriculture all my career, and so with a stint on farmer collaboration. And there's never been a better time for farmers to work together, because this is a new market. So, that would be my plea for farmers, to think about actually how you can leverage your position through working together.
Kate?
I don't think the rest of the panel's going to really like what I've got to say now, but on the biodiversity credit front, we have made an active decision not to engage in that market. Simplistic it might be, but we cannot get away from emitting carbon as individuals, as businesses, as a species. I fundamentally believe that we can get away from biodiversity destruction, and I can make twice as much probably on biodiversity that I can on carbon, but I am not going to go down that route, because I will not facilitate the destruction of biodiversity.
So that depends on you being involved in an offset market, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But if it's being monitored correctly and adequately, and a quick shameless plug here for Soil Association Exchange, which does, of course, monitor carbon and biodiversity at the farm level, you could be rewarded for that, for instance, by supermarkets, if it's clear that you are getting biodiversity gains on your farm.
I don't deal with the supermarket.
Pardon? You don't? Okay, right, good answer, fair enough. Other people might, though.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. Okay, to the back, please, lest I'm accused of being short-sighted.
Hi, I'm Matt from the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. So I wanted to ask the panel about their perception on the importance of local level actors in this. In the absence of a land use framework from government, we're still waiting. Spatial prioritisation could be done through local nature recovery strategy adherence. In Oxfordshire, we're close to creating a mandatory carbon market through developers, where local plans are requiring net zero developments, and developers will be required to offset any emissions that they can't stop emitting on site. So there's demand there. Recently, Blenheim sold carbon for 50 quid a tonne. That was 2 or 3 years ago. The price, you can exceed more than that with a really well-planted design. Warwickshire's work has shown that the true cost of creating and managing woodland for 100 years is over 200 quid a tonne, which mirrors the Bay's social cost of carbon. So I plead to not undersell, and also, a question: what do you think the importance of local level actors, intermediaries like the Gloucestershire Climate and Nature Fund, or TOW, who do BNG in Oxfordshire, the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment? Do you think those intermediaries are important in this market in the absence of strong government leadership?
Ooh, big question. Anyone want to go on that?
So, when you were asking the question, I was sort of thinking about it, and certainly I think keeping things as local as possible keeps them really real, because the people who are looking to get the credits can directly talk to those businesses that might better provide them, which I think keeps everybody much more honest than if it's all far away and totally anonymous. And so therefore, yes, I think it is the way to go, but clearly that also I think it still requires some form of regulation, or at least some governance that everybody agrees is the way to do it. And I do think there's also still a need to have some kind of, and I think Lydia mentioned it, some kind of place where all these things sit to avoid double counting and things like that. But then I was thinking for perhaps myself and Kate, although Kate seems to have got it sussed, that there are some parts of the country where there's less things going on. So I guess if you were up in the Highlands of Scotland where there's not a lot of development going on, your local might be a lot bigger area than, say, around here where there's a lot going on your doorstep. So that would affect, I think, how big your locality would be. Okay. So, yeah.
Thank you, Liz. I think we're almost out of time, so just one quick question to the panelist finally before we're out of time. Go on, you go for it. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, one about the kind of massive focus on tree planting, but doesn't take into account, large-scale forest destruction, which has kind of been the area that I've been working in. So how can we look at the kind of the global impact that we can not just support tree planting, but support the forest to keep it standing? And the other, how can we talk about capturing carbon without also talking about algae and seaweed capturing? And if that comes into land analysis, when you're saying we've only got this much land, that's not equating into the ocean and how much we can capture through algae.
Okay, very quickly, does anyone want to go on that, Lydia? And that's going to have to be the end.
On forest destruction alongside tree planting, yeah, I think we need to keep all forests standing that we've got left if we're going to avoid the worst effects of climate change. How do we do that? There's a massive role for changing diets in that because lots of land is being cleared to grow feed for livestock. Is that a brief enough answer?
It's going to have to be brief enough. Thank you, Lydia. Okay, thank you very much to our panel. Hopefully that's given a sense of what we need to do to get to a place of expectation rather than hope. So could you please all thank the panel? And thanks for attending.